It's the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams. Joining me today is someone I've been sort of stalking. I don't like to use that word, but I've been watching the work of the Artemis or Artemis. I should get the spelling or the pronunciation right. The Artemis Station and the Artemis Nature Fund, and the secretary of the fund, who has obviously been on the station in far north Queensland, Steve Murphy. Hi, Steve. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, Grant. Thanks for having me.
Now, what we're going to do today is talk about the Golden-shouldered Parrot, which is one of those birds that's quite famous in the aviculture world and was extremely popular with bird keepers earlier in the 20th century, particularly in Europe. Now, that caused all sorts of pressures on the populations. I would imagine that there was a lot of trapping and whatnot, but we're not talking about trapping today. We're talking about habitat decline and invasive pests. What a surprise. So, Steve, can you tell us about the Artemis Station, what it does now, what's the operation, and why was the fund set up?
Yeah, no worries. So Artemis Station is 125,000 hectare property, about halfway up Cape York Peninsula in far north Queensland. So about halfway up in a north-south direction and halfway across in an east-west direction. So we're talking about central Cape York, and it has been run as a beef production property ever since it was sort of first gazetted, 50 or 60 years ago. And it's been in the same family the whole time, the Shepherd family. So Tom and Sue Shepherd are the current leaseholders. And Artemis is, I guess it's famous in the bird world because it's always been kind of the place that bird watchers can go and pretty much be guaranteed of seeing golden-shouldered parrots in the wild. So there's that side of it. And I guess what's also helped make it quite famous in addition to that is that it's the location where by far the majority of the field research, so the ecological research that's happened on this species, has occurred on Artemis going back to the 1990s, led by Stephen Garnett, Gay Crowley, and Sue Shepherd herself. So that's the sort of a potted history of Artemis. And I guess for many years, everyone has thought that the parrots on Artemis have been secure, that there's nothing to worry about. We knew that there was some declines elsewhere, like up around Cohen in particular, which is about 100 or so k's north of Artemis. The birds used to be super common there up until the 1920s, and they were last seen there in the 1950s. So we knew that the parrots, they had the potential of declining, and there had been some declines observed, but Artemis was always thought to be relatively immune and secure. And there was all that work done, and it included not only research, but also some activities that were more of the kind of land management kind of style where, subsections of Artemis were set aside as a nature refuge and stock were being managed in a particular way there, for the benefit of the parrots. And, back in the 90s, there was also a whole heap of, grant money come in to assist with cattle management by putting up fences and so on. So, so everyone thought, great, Artemis is cool. But, over the last few years, and I've been sort of travelling through Artemis and have known Tom and Sue for more than 20 years. I did my PhD research further north than there up near Lockhart River. But so I knew Tom and Sue, so I'd sort of vaguely kept in touch. And it has become clear that the parrots on Artemis aren't immune from decline. In fact, they're heading down the same pathway as the birds probably at Cohen. And so clearly something was wrong. The management investment that had happened previously in terms of fencing and all the rest of it, and it was kind of a relatively, I won't say hands off because things were done, but it was, let's put up some fencing, let's manage the stock and everything will be right. That clearly wasn't working. And so a couple of years ago, I found myself in a pretty luxurious position of being given a position at the University of Queensland where I could basically develop any sort of high impact conservation project that I wanted. And so I started talking to Sue Shepherd then and just to get a bit of a feel about what was happening. And what she told me was absolutely alarming. She said that she thought there was as few as 50 birds left, and she reckoned that certainly within her lifetime they'll disappear from the property. And for people out there who have met Sue, you'll know that Sue she's just no fuss. There's no hyperbole. There's no exaggeration. She is just statement, matter of fact kind of lady. And when she said that to me, I was just completely floored and blown away And so we decided then and there, I said, let's try and do this. I've got a position for a couple of years. It's part-time at the moment, but let's try and develop it into something bigger. Let's try and do whatever we can to solve this. And that led to the establishment of the fund and all that sort of stuff.
So before we talk about the birds, let's talk about what the habitat is there. What will a visitor see the first time they're there?
If a visitor went to Artemis today, they would see a lot of tropical savanna woodland. If a visitor went to Artemis and could travel in time and went back 50 years, they would see lots of open grasslands. So there'd be open grasslands surrounded by sparse open woodlands. Now, and what we see today is totally different. Those grasslands have pretty much disappeared from Artemis altogether. And this is the places where the parrots, they use several different habitats, but those grasslands are some of the most important breeding habitats.
Are the dominant tree species eucalypts, or is it a mixture of eucalypt, acacia, or melaleucas? What's the sort of the mix of the altered country? And is that different in terms of the percentage makeup of the flora than what it would have looked like if we time travelled back?
100%. So if you got a species list today and compared it to a species list from 50 years ago or 100 years ago, they'd be the same species are there, more or less. But it's the composition or the relative abundance and density of the different species which has changed profoundly. And there is a suite of these invasive native woody plants that have done well out of the last sort of 50 years of land management there. And the leader in the pack is Melaleuca viridiflora, the broadleaf tea tree. And so people coming up there today would just see like areas of tea tree that you would sort of struggle to walk through with your arms open. It's that dense. It's incredible. Yeah.
It seems a little bit incongruous, doesn't it, in terms of management, that for someone like me down south in the city, I've never been as far north as Artemis and certainly not up to Cohen. But to think that the management practices would encourage keeping the grassland open rather than allowing the invasive native plants to close it off. But that's really a function of station life in modern times, isn't it? That stations are run by a handful of people, maybe 2 or 3 people, rather than 50, 60, 70 years ago where there might have been a staff of 20 or 30 and that vegetation would have been kept in check.
Yeah, look, that's true. You're dead right. I mean, the number of people on these properties has been declining steadily over the last few decades. But in the case of Artemis and the issues that is confronting that property, it's the combination of cattle grazing and a long history of early dry season, low intensity fires that's actually led to the encroachment of these grasslands by these woody plants. So even had, there been lots of people, on the station working, as ringers and whatever else, I'm not sure that this process would have changed that much, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, so vegetation management has never really been a priority in the management of this kind of operation.
Well, it has. Vegetation management has been important to all station owners. I mean, that's kind of, what they're there for. They talk about kind of grazing country in the same way as ecologists talk about habitat. So it's sort of that they are interested in vegetation management. It's just, I guess, this process has taken some years to play out, and it's really only kind of manifested itself in the chronic problem that it is in the last sort of decade or so, I suppose, in this area around Cape York. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The history of Artemis is one, like I mentioned before. There was some efforts to do some internal fencing on Artemis to manage stock better. That actually, in some ways, has perversely made the problem worse. So whereas historically pre-fencing, the cattle were just on the property and they were roaming around wherever they needed and wanted, and they were sort of, their distribution was dictated to by the availability of water. And then, come mustering time, when it was time to make some money, the station owners would go out on horseback and just find wherever on the property where the cattle were and muster them in and so on. And it was thought that, okay, there'd be a co-benefit to the parrots and the cattle operation if we got some internal fencing and we were able to more closely manage what were perceived to be stock impacts at the time. But perversely, what's happened is it's allowed the intensification of grazing in some of these sort of internal paddock areas now. And so the problem that sort of is a combination of grazing, continually kind of reducing fuel loads, and then a sort of a desire to avoid intense fires has amplified the problem of vegetation thickening. So it's sort of interesting that, this conservation initiative that happened 20 years ago, which has actually made the problem in some ways worse.
So when we talk about burning for management, one of the things we need to consider is the practices of the settlers as against the practices of the traditional owners, the Indigenous people from the area. What's the relationship like with the traditional owners, and what kind of population? How many traditional owners are still on country?
Well, to answer the first question, or last part of your question first. So Cape York's, it seems like everywhere in Australia has a different kind of history in terms of traditional owners and their associations, I suppose, with the colonists. And on Cape York, it was one of, and I'm speaking very generally here, but one of, dispossession of country, and people moved into settlements kind of within the region or sometimes even outside of the region. And so I guess, for the majority of, this past 200 odd years, it's been a story of centralisation of traditional owners into communities, and they haven't had much access to country. Now, over the last 10 years or so, as zeroing in from those sort of broad sweeping statements around Cape York and narrowing in around the Artemis story, I guess it was within the last 10 years, there was a group of 5 properties were purchased from the state government and actually handed back to the Orkla traditional owners, who were pretty much living mostly in Cowan and Cooktown and Cairns and Mareeba and places like that. And so that's been a really wonderful kind of opportunity for those guys to get their country back and get access to country and start kind of, managing and engaging with their country again. So they're the properties immediately to the south of Artemis. So the Artemis, the traditional owners on Artemis, the Taipan people, and they are still living, representatives of Taipan people living on another property called Mary Valley, south of Artemis, and also Laura and those other places. And look, the relationship with Artemis is a very strong one, and it's based mostly on the history of cattle grazing, in fact. So like many of these properties in northern Australia, Artemis, made use of and employed a lot of Indigenous people, particularly early on when there was a lot of, most of the work was being done with, horses and that sort of stuff. So Tom and Sue Shepherd know intimately many aspects of the culture of Taipan and Orkla, and know many of the people and all of the families, and are an incredibly well-respected, almost, I would dare to say, as sort of almost like elders in their own community. So, yeah.
So it sounds like it's a really positive relationship, and there's obviously an emphasis on that cooperative management that the fund is promoting. So that's sort of a beacon for hopefully some other areas of Australia, but time will tell.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I need to acknowledge, the Orkla properties to the south, they are very active in golden-shouldered parrot conservation and management. And to Orkla people, golden-shouldered parrots are called arwa. And Bush Heritage Australia have been working with Orkla for many years on developing healthy country planning or plans and putting in place both monitoring and management of that country to benefit the parrot. And look, we work really closely with Bush Heritage and Orkla through the fund and on things like feral cat control and Sue in particular. It's really important to stress that no one knows more about these parrots than Sue Shepherd. She's lived on Artemis most of her life. She knows these parrots inside out. And so when Orkla were given that country back and they wanted to start doing work with parrots, Sue was the first person they contacted. And Sue's been absolutely critical in training up the rangers there on about how to find nests and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah.
And we should note that apart from living on Artemis and co-owning it, Sue sits on the Golden-shouldered Parrot recovery team and has authored some of the previous recovery plans. And look, I have to say, it's a heavy-hitting management committee, isn't it, that you've got for the fund? I mean, you've got Kay Crowley, as you mentioned earlier, Stephen Garnett, Nick Leesburg, Kerry Wakefield, who is on Artemis, and James Watson and Patrick Webster. That's heavy hitting. So I think we can be confident that any works are going to be well done and that we should get useful results, or we hope so. So let's talk about the bird before we talk about the methodology of the studies that you're wanting to do, Steve. The golden-shouldered parrot is, I think most people will only have seen them in an aviary, and they're about the size of a red rump parrot, or a mulga parrot or bluebonnet, but they've got a longer tail. So when you see them, if they flash by, they look bigger, but they're still quite a small bird.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm just looking at some capture data now. Actually, we're talking about about a 50-gram bird. So that they're very small, but you're right, their tail is quite long. You're talking about 150 mils for their tail length. So, yeah.
And apart from needing this specialised habitat with the optimal density and composition of trees, shrubs and grasses, so open woodland or open savanna woodland, that's probably the...
Yeah, I'd probably summarise it by saying a mix of grasslands and sparse open savanna. Yeah.
Okay. Now, what native mammals are there? Because we're going to talk about cats. So has there been a real decline of the mammals that we would expect to be as part of their normal range?
Yeah, absolutely. So Artemis is no different to most other places in northern Australia that suffered particularly a sort of small to medium-sized mammal decline. So, yeah, things like, it's amazing. I live on the Atherton Tablelands and it's a highly modified farming system here, and it's just crawling with northern brown bandicoots and long-nosed bandicoots. It's quite amazing. And as I drive up, and as I drive down the street here and I see roadkill bandicoots almost on a daily basis, I've never seen a bandicoot on Cape York. Well, in this sort of part of Cape York anyway. So things like really common species, they should be there, but they're not. I haven't seen a northern brown bandicoot on Artemis, and other things as well. They've completely sort of dropped out of the system. But there's some other native mammals that have done incredibly well. So agile wallabies are now, you can't even call them abundant. They're hyper abundant, and they're probably good reasons for that. Again, wrapped up in this kind of pastoral, history of managing the country. So it's been a bit of a sort of a mixed response to native mammals.
Has the fox made it? Has the fox made it up that far?
No, foxes don't occur anywhere north of basically the Atherton Tablelands. So yeah, it's actually a bit interesting. I know we're not talking about the Atherton Tablelands, but the Atherton Tablelands is one of the few places in Australia where you get rabbits and no foxes. And if anyone can answer why, I'd love to hear.
Well, maybe that's a good project for someone to do. Look for some grant money and get going. Okay. What else about the golden-shouldered parrot is really specialised?
I guess the main thing that's, that really strikes you is that their habit of nesting inside termite mounds. So about this time of the year, the pairs will start visiting mounds and start excavating a small tunnel leading to a chamber inside the termite mound in which they'll lay their, 4 or 5 eggs and raise their young. So it's quite amazing. They're also one of 3 parrots that did this in Australia. 2 now, yeah, that's right. And of course, most famously, we've lost paradise parrots, which were very similar in many respects to golden-shouldereds. And I think, when we think about golden-shouldered parrots, we've got to constantly remind ourselves of the story of paradise parrots, because it's a huge motivator for me when we've got the writing on the wall with golden-shouldered parrots about, how dramatic their decline has been. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we've been here before, and now is the time to do something.
When I was a kid, Steve, we're talking 5, 6, 7, that was one of my fantasies, that someone like Vincent Saventi would rediscover an unknown population of paradise parrots. But in all that time, nope. So tell me, Steve, before we get too sidetracked, how long is the nest tunnel and what's the size of the chamber? How much excavating are the birds having to do?
Yeah, so it varies a little bit depending on the species and size of the termite mound, but typically the tunnel's about 10 to 15 centimetres long, and the cavity at the end's about the size of a large grapefruit, is the best way to describe it. Yeah.
Okay. And let's just talk about termites for a moment. invasive species of insect, I'm thinking crazy ant or fire ant, something like that, are they a threat to the termites, which in turn are a threat to the parrot?
Yeah, not yet, thankfully. So there's none of those invasive ants, as far as I know, none very close to the area we're talking about. I mean, it's actually a good thing to keep in mind, though, that, there are little pockets of them in far north Queensland and around places like Cairns. So, being vigilant about that kind of thing is critically important because, yeah, as we've seen on, places like Christmas Island, they're just an ecological game changer when an animal like that gets into the system. So yeah, nothing yet. But that's not to say that all is well in the world of termites. And I mean, the preface to what I'm about to say is that it's remarkable how little we know about the ecology of termites, even these sort of special ones that are associated with these charismatic birds. I've tried my best to find out some ecological information about, a couple of the key termite species, and there's very little known. And yet, if we think about Cohen again, we mentioned Cohen as the place where golden-shouldered parrots used to be really quite common. And I know that Stephen Garnett and Gay Crowley went up to the areas where they were common in the 1920s. They went there in the 1990s. And not only did they find grasslands that were now woodlands, but they literally didn't find any termite mounds. So there's something, quite fundamental about the way that these landscapes or these habitats are shifting, not only to influence things like predation dynamics, which is something we'll talk about some more, but also, influencing some of these critical elements in the landscape like termite mounds.
Well, that's probably a good place to talk about predation, Steve, before we go into sort of the nuts and bolts of the fund and then what the fund will do. We talked about cats, the major problem that you've highlighted. Who's done the work so far on predators, and what do you know?
Yeah, so the work, I'm in a lucky position in some ways because there's so much of that early work that was done by Stephen and Gay and Sue has set up this, this really sort of solid foundation upon which we can not only test ideas but actually also act. So all of the, the knowledge about, thickening and predation dynamics and the loss of some key grasses all comes from that early ecological research. And so, the main thing to emerge from that early work was that, or one of the main theories was that it's the encroachment of native plants into these open habitats has allowed ambush predators to become either more common and or more effective in the way they hunt. And so we're talking about things like pie butcherbirds, blackback butcherbirds, also kookaburras, collared sparrowhawks, brown goshawks, and even things like spangled drongos, which have been seen dive bombing parrots on occasion. So we're talking about a sort of a new predator landscape, if you like, and one that's sort of dominated by ambush predators that are doing and
they're very intelligent and adaptable. I think anyone who's ever started visiting butcherbirds or magpies or currawongs know exactly how cluey those little fellas can be at working out where to find a meal.
100%. And Sue also talks about the idea that, there's individual butcherbirds who visit active nests and kind of defend them until they're ready to harvest, basically. So they are incredibly intelligent, if you like, but there's also other aspects of the ecology that make them kind of even better suited to this changed landscape, and that is group living and cooperative breeding. So we've started in the last 12 months trying to get a really accurate assessment of how many butcherbirds there are in parts of Artemis. And so we're doing things like capturing birds and colour banding. And the number of groups we're finding is quite interesting. So we'll go into a territory and there'll be 3 or 4 adult birds attending a nest, for example. And so it's kind of interesting that they've got that adaptability in their life history. That means when they find themselves in a landscape that's saturated, so there's no territory vacancies, well then the offspring can just stay at home and then they can help raise young in subsequent years. And of course, from a prey perspective, that's just more butcherbird mouths to feed. It's not like they've got this obligatory dispersal sort of system where it's only ever a pair of adults in a territory. They can have family groups, which puts even more pressure on these systems.
And one of the things I found interesting, Stephen, in the literature was that the butcherbirds maintain small territories. So if they can find suitable food sources, the population density could be huge compared to the population density of the parrot.
Yeah, absolutely huge. And this is stuff that we're working really hard on at the moment to trying to, prove up or get really confident in our assessment of it. But the early work we've done suggests that, yes, the home ranges are really small. And I'm actually, the point of the trip starting tomorrow for a fortnight is to do more work on that. So we're capturing birds and putting tiny little GPS trackers on them and really getting a better picture of home range size.
Okay, well, let's talk about how the study that you're about to start is designed. What are the methods that you're using to collect data? You've talked about bird banding and whatnot, but are you doing things like camera traps and even audio recording? How are you going about it?
Yeah, look, so we're doing all that sort of stuff. But I'll just start by saying, I'm pretty keen to point out that this is, first and foremost, this is an active, practical conservation management project.
Yeah.
So it's
an ongoing operation. I understand that. 100%. And I was sloppy in the terminology because the Nature Fund that's based around the property is to generate funding for ongoing work. That's how I understand it. And obviously then to formally protect the optimum habitat as time goes on, depending on what the research tells you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's right. So it's pretty clear what we need to do. Thanks to that early work that's established this kind of conceptual framework of the problems, it just sets out a menu for us to follow, a recipe. So we are, first and foremost, we want to modify the environment, modify the habitats to alleviate the predation pressure and thereby increase survivorship of birds. I mean, it's sort of as simple as that, really. So, but in order to make sure that we're on the right track and that conceptual model is actually accurate, we can't just go out there with, brush cutters and chainsaws and poison and start knocking over trees. We need to do it in a very structured way and pick up on some key kind of strategically chosen elements in the ecosystem, which will give us some feedback that we are on the right track. And so, one of those key things is the parrots themselves. So we are colour banding parrots as they come into the feeders. So they're being supplementary fed, and that's a whole kind of another story. But yeah, so we're colour banding parrots. So we're trying to get a more accurate assessment of population size and then hopefully survivorship. But we're also, getting a much better handle, or trying to get a better handle on the predation story. And of all those predators I mentioned before, it really is butcherbirds that do seem to be the number one kind of public enemy, if you like, out there. So we are, capturing and colour banding butcherbirds to work out territory size, group sizes, habitat use, and we're supplementing that with some GPS tracking to give us even better information about those same things. And what we're hoping, the way that the sort of system, or the study system, if you like, is set up, is that we're generating a whole heap of pre-management information. So, butcherbirds doing now in this kind of thickened state, and what do they do after we get in there and we open up these habitats. And what we're hoping to see is that territory size increases, maybe the group size decreases, and hunting efficiency decreases. And so they're the kind of the main things we're doing in terms of the research aspects of our activities that are supporting the management. Another aspect is feral cats. And
sorry, before we move on to cats, do we know if the butcherbirds, the two species, are having a similar effect on other bird species populations and the lizards and the small mammals? Do we know is it mostly the parrots and maybe one or two other species, or is it across the board?
It's a really good question, and the short answer is we don't know, but we just assume. So in the time that Sue's been there, which is, again, many decades, she's noticed declines in other grassland birds, like some of the small finches, marsh finches, black-throat finches, used to be relatively common up there. She used to have them coming into the house. She doesn't see them anymore. So yeah, short answer is we don't know, but the longer answer is that, if we infer what's going on, it makes perfect sense that they're having a massive impact on the whole system. And, I've got a pretty keen ear for redback fairy wrens, for example, after having worked on them on another project some years ago. And so my ears always prick up when I hear them. I know of 2 groups in the 2,000 hectare kind of main part of the area we're working. So, and that just doesn't ring true, that there should be, a group every, 100 meters or so almost. There should be a super abundant bird, but they're just not. So I think, yes, you're right. We are collecting some information. Getting back to your question earlier about techniques, we've got some automatic recording units positioned in, parts of the area that we are going to be modifying. And so the opportunity to do some, pre and post management assessment of the bird community more generally is there. Yeah.
Well, let's come back to the technology and the actual methods after we talk about cats, because that was where I interrupted you.
Cats. So the cat story, it's an interesting one. A couple of years ago, the Orkla Rangers were monitoring a golden-shouldered parrot nest on their country on Killarney, and on one of the camera traps was captured a big cat sort of walking up to the parrot nest and reaching up, putting its paw in and just hooking out the nestlings one after the other. And it was sort of shocking to see it. And so, for the first time ever, people started thinking, oh, hell, I mean, maybe cats are actually, we know they're a big problem in other systems. Maybe they're just as big a problem here. So the potential, I guess, is there for cats to be a big problem. And another kind of line of evidence to kind of make me sit up and take notice, if you like, is over the last few years I've been helping the Orkla Rangers with cat management. So I go down there a couple of weeks of the year and we go spotlighting and shooting cats. And I've done that in other places of Australia as well. And I've never seen a higher cat density than I have seen in this area of Cape York. So, the last trip we were out there, I think in 4 nights we shot 24 cats or something. So it's, so if you consider those things, right? So we've got a small population of parrots. We've got at least some cats who know about parrot nests and how to, go and get a feed. And we've got a high cat density. So that, to me, spells trouble. And one of the things that we're particularly aware of, I guess, is that, once you start talking about going in and manipulating habitats in the way that we're doing, you could end up with a perverse situation on your hands where you've actually made things better for cats. So, and if you think, for example, we're going to go into these areas that should be grasslands, and we're basically going to clear all the trees on them to restore grasslands. And by doing so, we're going to create an edge. And we want to know, is that edge then going to be a hotspot of cat activity? Because the last thing we want to do is draw more cats into an area where there are only a few parrots. So to keep a bit of an eye on that, we're capturing feral cats and we're putting GPS collars on them, and those collars will last about 18 months. And we're going to be able to get the same sort of information, pre-management information and post-management information. Are we attracting cats to these areas? Because if we, there's no point burying your head in the sand over this stuff. If it's going to happen, we need to know about it, because that's the only chance way you're going to have a chance to act on it.
You sent me back to the mid-'80s there, Steve, to geography and environmental science and the edge effect.
Especially when you're talking about cats.
Yeah. And I think it's so obvious that we often don't think about it. It's not front of mind whenever we talk about, because it has a reverse effect, the clearing, but also re-establishing habitat. We're playing around, and the thing I really like about the Artemis project, for want of a better term, is that you are doing the baseline study and not assuming what you need to know, and you're working off some really great work that's been done over decades. I think it's an unusual situation that the same people have been on the land, both Indigenous and the settler family, for want of a better term, the farmers, the graziers, have been in place continuously for so long. So all of the changes, what's been done, the alterations are all documented and in the living memory of the people that you and other researchers will stand next to and talk to, which I think is probably pretty unusual.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, actually. I hadn't thought of it that way. And it's both unusual, and it's also, when I think about it, it's probably the most important and valuable aspect of this whole project, this whole campaign that we're on, is that, we don't have to convince the landholders of the need to do this. We don't have to try and build, the value of this species in the mind of the landholders. That's already there. So, and that is something that I found attractive about this whole system, this whole situation right from the get-go, is that, as you describe it, the knowledge is there in the people who are still on the country and who still have control over that country. And we have like I said before, we have a very clearly defined rule book to work with. And the parrots have declined, from Artemis. They're now only hanging on Artemis by a toehold. They really are. But they're still there. So, it's sort of rare that you get a situation where you've got a, consenting landholder with a huge amount of investment and knowledge wanting to do this, wanting to do something. And she just needed enabling, or the family just needed enabling to be able to do it. And to be able to get in there and have a well-defined set of things to do while the parrots are still there. If we can't make this work, kind of God help us in a way, like this should be an easy one. And so let's just see if we can make it work. We should be able to get these parrots back. The main area we're trying to restore, it's actually a declared nature refuge. It was set up for the parrots over 20 years ago. Parrots have not been seen there for 10 years. That's one of the main areas we want to restore. The birds aren't far away. They're only about 5 or 7 k's to the south, still breeding. So if we can't get them back to that nature refuge now, we've got big problems, So, yeah.
Steve, I'll just throw this one at you. You're saying the birds aren't in the nature reserve, but they are 5 odd kilometres away. Where else do you know that the parrot is hanging on in other properties, other locations? And would you have a stab at the approximate breeding population? So
there's 2 kind of discrete areas that the parrots occur. One is this sort of northern population, of which Artemis is the very northern edge, and then it occurs on Dixie, which is an Ocula property to the south, and then Killarney, and then that's it. So we're talking about kind of 80 to 100 k's of distribution there, and then there's a big gap of about 150 k's or 200 k's to the southwest on Staten River National Park, and that's Wakaman country. And so Staten River, Bulimba, and we really actually don't know how many birds there are there. By all indications, they're doing better there. The habitat does seem more open. It's been a national park for a lot of years. It's quite an inaccessible national park. It's been destocked it's only got some small numbers of feral cattle on there, I suppose, which are being actively managed, and fire's been actively managed. So the country there just looks like it's in better condition. But to have a population estimate is, wow, like it's just, as with so much of this stuff, the number I give you is sort of more indicative than real. But, I would say that, we're talking about hundreds of birds in the northern population and maybe the same in the southern. So I'd say that if someone told me that, the world population of golden-shouldered parrots is 1,000, I'd be pleasantly surprised. If they told me it was 5,000, I'd tell them to stop smoking their drugs. So,
there is a little bit of a silver lining in that there is a very large population in captivity, and the gene pool for that is, I would imagine, is quite diverse, because they were popular in Europe, 80 odd years ago, and those populations would be different to any of the trap birds that have been in the local market or in the Asian market from the last sort of 30, 40 years. So there's only that little bit of ray of light that if the works with the fund are successful, that there is some potential to reintroduce if it was required. But the wild populations, Steve, are they distinct? Are they isolated, or do we think there is some crossover?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's certainly appropriate habitat between the 2 areas. Now, there's no contemporary records, though, and we're talking about some country that's, it's got some relatively large roads through it, so it's not like it's inaccessible country. But interestingly, the Ocula sort of story and songlines suggest that the birds moved between kind of the rocky upland country on Ocula country through to the Gulf Plains. So that's the kind of cultural storyline that kind of suggests that, maybe at least historically they were connected, if not now. Yeah.
And that perhaps that was seasonal movement, that they, partly nomadic, partly migratory even.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, we certainly see local seasonal movements from the kind of lowland flood-out areas where a lot of these grasslands should be up into the rocky slopes and rocky hillsides. That happens annually. So, yeah, so who knows? And look, one of the first birds to be collected, if not the first bird, was actually all the way over near Normanton. So that's sort of right out in the Gulf. So, yeah.
Did Gilbert shoot that one?
I don't know who shot it, actually. He might have. He shot paradise parrots, didn't he?
Yeah. No, I'm thinking he certainly did a lot of them. So we've talked about the two major stakeholders so far, Steve, and that's the traditional owners and the shepherds. Who are the other stakeholders in the fund, and what were the challenges in getting the fund set up and then getting the permissions to operate the way you want to?
Yeah, so the reason we needed a fund was because, all of this work that needs to be done is on Artemis. It's a privately held lease, cattle lease. So it was difficult to get, attract the attention or support of other existing organisations. And so what we thought was that, parrots have got high enough profile, and indeed Artemis itself is visited by enough people that we thought that we could garner enough support from the average person to help financially in order for us to, do the work that was needed. And so that's when we thought about the idea of establishing, an entity. And that sort of helps separate, the activities of that we needed to do around the parrots.
Yeah.
That's right. And people need that kind of, that degree of confidence and separation. And indeed, Tom and Sue themselves wanted that separation. And it also meant that we were able to approach groups like the local natural resource management group and say, hey, this is what we want to do. This is what we've done. This is the entity we've set up. Can we have some funding? And they've been absolutely fantastic in providing us with some support. So I started, working through my networks about, talking to people who have been involved in similar stuff like this. And it led me to a guy called Jim Phillipson, who lives in Victoria, not far from where you're sitting. And has
I know his accounting practice well in Victoria. Phillipson's is one of the giants.
There you go. You go.
Yep.
So Jim is absolutely tremendous. So passionate conservationist and, a strong believer in ground up conservation activities. And he's been incredibly supportive and helpful and outright just, helping us out with all those sorts of governance and accounting kind of mechanisms and institutions that you need to establish a fund like this. So we've pretty much got world's best practice accounting behind this fund, which was really important to us from the get-go, partly to make our lives easier and also just, again, to build the confidence in people who might consider supporting us.
Donations to the fund tax deductible?
Well, good question. So given we're only a very young entity, we haven't got deductible gift recipient status ourselves because it actually costs quite a bit of money. I think it's about a $10,000 setup and it's about $10,000 annually. So we've partnered with Landcare Australia, and what that means is that they've actually looked at who we are and what we're trying to do, and they've kind of given us their endorsement. And so people who are looking for tax deductibility can donate to Landcare, and then Landcare, as being kind of like a partner, Landcare will then direct the funds to us.
Yeah. So that's great because that's always an important thing, especially when it comes to corporate donations. They generally want the tax deductibility attached. So how was it dealing with, there's a number of government and quasi-government bodies that you're partnered with. You've got the university, obviously, which is providing yourself, I'm guessing, and some of the other members of the management team. You got Landcare, as you mentioned, but you've got the Queensland Government, Water and Land Conservation, and you've got the National Environmental Science Program, and, of course, the body of Cape York Natural Resource Management, and you've got the TOs. So how difficult was it meshing all the permissions you needed to satisfy all those institutional stakeholders who lovingly called partners? Yeah.
Look, it sort of wasn't that hard, really, because they're all in there and they're listed as partners and they're all involved for very specific reasons. So I think once you get, an external party involved for genuine reason, then the partnership just is what it is. It's genuine, So take, for example, the Queensland Water and Land Carers Association, which is associated with Landcare. They provide us with our insurance requirements. So they learned about what we did. We put in applications. We talked to them. They said, yeah, you align with our values and what we are here for. We will give you insurance. So that's an example, so it's a really practical, tangible thing that they're contributing. And so the partnership's just built on that. So for someone like for NESP, the National Environmental Science Program, one of their flagship projects led by Professor Martine Marin at the university is declining woodland birds. And that's got a very strong Southern Australian focus. And I began talking to Martine about this Artemis situation a couple of years ago. And she's really excited by it and said, look, this could actually fit nicely into our existing woodland bird project. And so it did. It just slotted in nicely. We received some funding from NESP and away we go. So again, it's this sort of really genuine needs-based relationship that, we call a partner. So, yeah, so it's actually been probably not as unwieldy or complicated as you might first think. Yeah.
Now, we did touch briefly on this before we pushed the go button when we were getting to know each other, Steve. Dealing with the government and destroying native vegetation. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, isn't it interesting? So here we are talking about conservation and threatened species recovery, and we're also talking about getting out the chainsaws and clearing saws and herbicides. So we are clearing native vegetation. Let's not mince words. The nuance is that this is native vegetation that is out of balance, that is encroaching onto a highly threatened ecosystem, which is the grasslands of Cape York. So all along, no one has ever questioned the motives behind what we're doing, what we're proposing to doing, and why. And, that's partly because it's been written into every species recovery plan that's ever been written about this species. The need for maintaining an open structure of habitat. And I guess the thing about our work, though, is that, for a long time, people thought that open habitat structure could be maintained purely by the use of fire. And it's very clear that, the system has changed so much now that even the hottest fires won't reset the system back to an open state, and that we need to roll up our sleeves and get pretty serious and pretty aggressive about some management actions early on in the piece, and that involves clearing trees. So one of the things that we decided to do very early on was be 100% compliant with state legislation around vegetation management. And so, in Queensland, we have the Queensland Vegetation Management Act, which basically prevents people from doing what we were proposing to do, and for good reason. So we wanted to, get a permit, and I thought that might take a month or two. And in fact, it took nearly 2 years to get the approvals to undertake the proposed habitat restoration works. And we're able to invoke a part of the Act that is going to allow us to do it. And look, I've got to say that the department has been, it's the Department of Natural Resources, that's the department responsible for administering that Act. They've been incredibly helpful, and I think they've learned as much as us actually about how we can kind of navigate our way through the Act and remain compliant in a situation like this, which is clearing for conservation, basically. So, and I understand why they've needed to be very cautious. The last thing they wanted to do, and certainly the last thing we wanted to do, was to set up some sort of precedent loophole to allow farmers to go out and clear wholesale with some sort of spurious claim to conservation benefits. So we've tiptoed our way through the Act with the department's help very carefully, and we've arrived at a situation where we're going to be able to do this work. It's very prescribed, so it's very spatially explicit. We've been able to provide evidence to the department about what it looked like before, and I must acknowledge the help of the Queensland Herbarium in this as well. So in Queensland, we have this, much of the Queensland's vegetation management comes back to this data set called regional ecosystem mapping, and that's like the benchmark for habitat in Queensland. Now, the unfortunate thing about the area we're talking about on Artemis is that the regional ecosystem mapping, when it's done kind of in a general sense, it has these limits about what it will map. So what features of the landscape it will consider mappable, if you like. And so none of the critical grasslands on Artemis were actually mapped in the regional ecosystem mapping, which made it really hard for us from the get-go. So when we first went to the department and said, we want to restore these habitats, the first thing they do is look up the RE mapping, and all they see is woodlands, and they say, what grasslands? Yeah, that's right. And so we were able to engaged Queensland Herbarium and the department and Cape York Natural Resource Management to say, look, these are the aerial photos from the 1950s. You can see the grasslands here. And in fact, they were so good, you could see the termite mounds in the grasslands. And so the Queensland Herbarium, they sat down and they remapped some of these core areas. And so now we've got, officially designated grasslands on Artemis that now we can say to the department, hey, look, this is legitimate. This is not just us saying that these should be grasslands. These are the state government's own botanists saying that these should be grasslands and therefore they need.
Steve, apart from needing to get permission to clear, and I'm guessing that you're not setting up 2 drots and a chain, you're actually pinpointing individual trees. So all of this is really time consuming. And there's been 2 years of your investment, your time investment. So somebody's got to pay for all of that. But I wanted to explore what other permissions you needed. You mentioned that you're banding. Are you a licensed bander? Because I don't know if everyone would be aware that you can't just head out into the bush with a mist net and ban some birds.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's a highly controlled and regulated activity. So, yeah, I am a bander. I've been a bander since the 90s, mid-90s. And I'll say this about banding is that I don't take it lightly. I mean, if we could figure out a way of answering these important questions without capturing it, I'd do it in a heartbeat. Yeah. But the fact is that we need to do it. So we're very cautiously, we're capturing parrots and putting colour bands on them so we can identify individuals. And we're also doing the same with butcher birds, both species of butcher birds. And yeah, that activity alone requires 4 permits, state government permits. 5, because so there's 2 state government permits, there's animal ethics permit, and then there's 2 authorities from the Australian Bird and Bat Banding Scheme in Canberra. So it's heavily kind of regulated activity. So that's one suite of permits. To do the feral cat work, we also needed a separate ethics approval, and then we needed a permit from Biosecurity Queensland because it's illegal to release a feral cat alive. So, so there's just a whole slew of permits. And so that's just part of doing this kind of work, I guess. And then, of course, important to us was getting all the, endorsements and letters of support from the key stakeholders, being traditional owners, BirdLife Australia, and so forth. Yep. How
about GPS tracking? Is that part of the project?
Yeah, so GPS tracking is a really important part of the project, and we're doing it on the butcher birds, and that's to, better, I guess, get some really detailed, better information about home range and habitat use that the colour banding can only go so far to help us with. So we put these tiny little transmitters on birds that last about 6 or 7 or between 6 and 8 days, recapture them and get the data off, and that data is just amazing. And we're also at a particular part of the year when it's safe to do so, we're also proposing, we haven't done it yet, but we're proposing to do the same for the parrots. And the idea there is that we really need to understand how reliant individual parrots are on supplementary feeding. So how far are they coming to feed? How are they spending their time if they are feeding? And how can we use supplementary feeding potentially to help us recolonise some of these habitats as we go about restoring them?
It's really impressive, all the issues that you've been thinking about, Steve, and have taken into account in designing the study. So I think I certainly wish you well and hope that it provides all the information that we want. What's the timeline now, Steve?
So thanks to COVID and some permits that were a bit slow to come through, we are behind schedule a little bit. The big push for us at the moment is that come July this year, we want to start the actual habitat modification work. We want to start the clearing. And it's an interesting project in some ways because it's sort of there's a tension that exists between doing the science really well and thoroughly and just getting in there and doing the management. And so, if we wanted to do the science properly, I don't think we'd be ready to do it this year. We might not even be ready to do it next year. If we talk about things like sample sizes and proper replication and all that sort of stuff, like we could measure this stuff till the cows come home or the parrots left would be the case, like that. We just would run out of time. So, we've accepted some funding and have got commitments to actually start the habitat work this year. And look, frankly, I want to. These birds, we don't know how long these birds are going to be. This little residual population is going to be in Artemis. So we want to get in there and we want to get this work done. And so we've got this balancing act at the moment to work as hard as we can doing that kind of baseline pre-management science ahead of the actual, I won't say the real work, but the management work starting in July. Yeah.
And that's one of the compromises that is present all the time when you are comparing pure research and on-the-ground management. There's compromises in where the money goes, there's compromises in allocating the time and in determining what the desired outcomes are. So, one of the reasons for doing the podcast, Steve, is just to continually throw these things up, because I'm sure there's a lot of people like me who were just deflated and exasperated every time you start reading the conservation news. So we need to be aware of work like you're doing and then supporting it. So, of course, Artemis, artemis.org.au, and put some of your readies into the project. Steve, if you don't mind, because time's getting away, we'll move into the Steve part of the show. And
that's the least interesting part of what you want to talk about, I can assure you.
I'm not sure. You're at the University of Queensland now. What was the most significant beginning point of your academic career?
Well, I don't consider myself having an academic career, to be honest. I'm sort of a hybrid between a land manager and a conservation scientist, I suppose. So, look, I don't know. I mean, my PhD was really formative, which is a kind of a noncy thing to say because it is for everyone, I suppose. But that really opened my eyes up to issues around fire in particularly and land management. And that really kind of whet my appetite in terms of wanting to be involved in projects and programs that were not just doing research and measuring and monitoring. The thing that really floats my boat is getting in there and manipulating the system in the ways that we think it needs. And so my PhD, which was on palm cockatoos on Cape York, really was a good taster for that. And then from there, I went and worked for 7 years with Australian Wildlife Conservancy up in Mornington in the Kimberley and helped establish some of those programs up there. And that's where, that kind of that interest in wanting to manipulate systems, in the directions that we think they need to go for conservation outcomes, that's where those interests really flourished because, AWC was a tremendous organisation to work with because that just had such a can-do attitude, what's the problem? What's the solution? Right, let's just hook in and get it done, And I spent 7 years doing that and learnt a huge amount from my time there. So,
listeners overseas might not be aware that Australia is a federation of states and territories that all come together and sit under a federal government. So what, in your experience, Steve, what are the differences between the work you did with AWC and what you're doing now, Western Australia and Queensland?
There's more similarities than differences, I would say. Yeah. But what are you thinking there?
Oh, look, I just didn't know whether they're doing these sort of re-veg or alteration kind of projects might be harder to do under state legislation in one state with the other, or whether the bureaucracy isn't particularly progressive or schooled in a certain way to look upon a non-traditional project. So just curious, that's all about.
Yeah, look, I mean, I didn't, the sort of stuff that I was involved with in Western Australia, and then I went on to do similar work in South Australia, in northern parts of South Australia, it was all pretty related. Like it was land management and using tools that were kind of well accepted and well established. So it was, things like prescribed burning and destocking and feral animal control and all that sort of stuff. And in South Australia, it was all about prescribed burning with Indigenous traditional owners down there. So this is quite a step up, if you like. The Artemis work is a step up in terms of the level of, I guess, action and intervention. Yeah, that's the right word. The level of intervention required. This is a really, I'm not saying that there's not other people doing it. There's certainly lots of interventionist type conservation work, and re-veg is the sort of the classic one, but also feral-free areas and that. But in terms of open rangeland systems where it superficially looks quite intact and you wonder, well, what's going on here? This is quite interventionist in terms of those systems.
And it's super targeted, which I really like. I mean, it's focused on outcomes for one species, not a group. And really interesting and I think vital project, Steve.
Thanks.
Where do you see yourself academically, for want of another term, but your career focus you're going to be very busy with this, I would say, for 5 years at least, probably. Do you have a 10-year horizon is there something you really want to do after this?
Look, I think that the work we're doing on Artemis, I think there's a desperate need to replicate this elsewhere, and I think that, it's been said for a long time that, the conservation battle in Australia is going to be won on private land. That's where we can't rely on the National Parks estate to solve our problems. And so there's widespread acknowledgement of that, but there seems to be a bit of a shortfall in terms of capacity. There's lots of schemes out there that will help, private leaseholders or landholders to do general conservation type work. But this sort of work that we're doing at Artemis is just not general. It's like I said, it's incredibly targeted. It's very interventionist. It's very expensive, and it needs some really specialized kind of skills to be, assembled to do it. And I just think that there's a bit of a gap in that capacity to do that kind of work on privately held land elsewhere. Yeah. So I guess secretly I'm hoping that. Yeah.
Sorry, Steve, can I stop you there? Because you're talking about a gap in the capacity. Do you mean capacity in the knowledge or the availability of people, or is it the willingness of landowners to commit resources and the lack of a willingness of government bodies to also commit resources? Because we're talking about private money going into benefiting private landholders or leaseholders. So where do you see that lack of capacity being mainly at issue?
Yeah, it's a lack of capacity. I would say certainly not in terms of skills. I would say that we know what to do in most circumstances, or at least have a good enough idea of where to start. So I don't think that's the case. I think it's sort of a lack of structure. There's a lack of structures around that give people the confidence to invest in a conservation program, and that's either, government institutions like the NRM groups or private individuals. They need confidence to invest in a particular conservation program. There's also, a lack of confidence oftentimes from the perspective of the landholder. There's potentially some cynicism there, and, lack of relationships that need to be built up to do the work that's needed. I mean, we're very lucky at Artemis that, I already had a relationship with Tom and Sue, and they have been heavily involved in the conservation kind of sector for a lot of years. So they kind of knew that wasn't so much of an issue. But I think that broadly speaking, if there were some structures out there that help landholders to have more confidence in these kind of programs, that would be helpful. And then, just universities, the university system has, I guess, traditionally been a little bit reluctant to support, highly practical kind of outcomes-driven conservation work. It's all about, novel research and all the rest of it, which is really important. I'm not trying to say it is, but, if someone, I'm kind of lucky that my boss at the University of Queensland is motivated mostly by conservation outcomes. He just wants to see good stuff being done, and will remove the roadblocks that exist, in order for it to happen. Now, that's actually quite an unusual situation to have, and I think universities are very well placed to be able to do more of this kind of work and wind back the focus on novelty and publications and all the rest of it, and just let's establish a new set of metrics here about what is really meaningful and worthwhile in conservation science. And so I think that's when I talk about shortcomings and shortfalls and gaps. I suppose that's what I mean. Yeah.
I might venture an opinion, Steve. Feel free to not comment. I think governments also have seen conservation works as being a easy job creation mechanism whenever they've needed it, rather than to be guided always by the scientific advice and outcomes other than 25,000 people heading out to places with shovels and fencing wire.
Yeah, look, I think that's a fair comment. Yeah, I agree. And I think I can think of lots of different initiatives or actions that are required that really, they only take, a handful of people and a decent budget, and then we could solve some big issues.
Yeah, that's right. But it won't bring the jobless rate down, Steve. No. That's just my cynical view. Steve, when you're out doing field work, what's the field guide of choice?
Well, Pizzy up until a couple of years ago.
And now?
Yeah, the Australian Bird Guide or whatever it's called. To be honest, you're going to be disappointed, but I'm not a bird watcher. I mean, I can't remember the last time I took a field guide into the field, to be honest.
I'm like you're a little bit like me in a way. If I could, I'd take my key guide to the local vegetation and then the lizards and the pond life and the whole bit. So when you are out in the field, are you wholly and solely focused on the project and what's going on, or are you also going, "Ooh, nice lizard"?
Oh, look, it's mostly the work. Yeah, I mean, I might stop and look at a pretty lizard, and if I think about it later, I might try and look it up in a field guide. But yeah, it's certainly the work that needs to be done. Yeah.
So what's the favourite piece of kit when you're out and about?
Depends on what I'm doing.
Yeah, what do you rely on? Tell us about the situations. I mean, is it something as basic as a backpack?
No, I'm a bit of a gadget guy, so it's never just a backpack. It depends on doing. Like if it's, oh God, what's some examples?
Well, what are the first couple of things you pack?
Well, again, it depends on the field trip. So I've just, because tend to be thematic. I'm off tomorrow for 2 weeks. So, and this trip is all about capturing butcher birds and hopefully capturing parrots for colour banding and doing GPS tracking. So, I mean, GPS, you talk about, favourite bits of kit. These GPS tags that are being produced now are just absolutely phenomenal. And, if I've ever got a habitat use or any sort of spatial ecology question, then GPS tags are just the way to go. So they're a big favourite. But, if we're talking about, some of the other activities I'm involved with, cat management. So I do some cat research and management out in Western Queensland associated with night parrots. The first thing I'll pack is my, thermal optics, and just changing technology.
Yeah. And are you taking anything like the audio moth as well, just for interest to see what's around? Yeah.
Oh, look, I'm involved with some audio moth development actually in relation to night parrots as it happens. But for Artemis, I'm still using the wildlife acoustics sort of SM4s, which we've got a small fleet of them out there. And we touched on it earlier about, trying to pick up any sort of broader scale changes in the avifauna up there as we go about modifying habitats. So, look, I've used them lots and lots over the years. Camera traps are really important. And look, I've acknowledged that to tell this story properly and to garner the appropriate levels of support, we need just nice imagery of the birds in the landscape. And so I've just recently got hold of a couple of GoPro 9s. So I'm really looking forward to giving them a bit of a road test on this next field trip. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm still working with the Hero 3.
Okay. Well, you probably know more than me. I was struggling to turn it on the other day. But Sue's been out in the last week and I think she's up to about 7 active nests. So I'm hoping, we can set some little GoPros up on some of them. We should have some nice imagery to share on the website when we get back.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, you mentioned that you're not a birder, so I'm not going to ask you what your favourite bird is because you're going to tell me the Golden-shouldered Parrot.
Probably wouldn't.
Actually, ghost bird. It's going to be the ghost bird, is it?
No, black-shouldered kite. Exquisite.
Yeah, they are. Actually, that was a favourite of mine as a kid because they were so prolific down in southern Victoria. And, regal, and also that eyebrow is stunning if you look at them through binoculars. They're amazing to look at. How about a location, Steve? Have you got a bucket list location for where you want to get out and about and checking out the flora and the fauna?
Gee, I've been pretty lucky, about where I've been able to work and visit and live. Remaining places, I'd love to get to Tiwi Islands off the top end. There's some places in the Kimberley I'd like to visit that I never got to when I was there. But, one of my favourite places is the Queensland Channel Country in winter. It's just, there's something amazing about that country out there. Yep. Beautiful.
You're not a list keeper, eh? You can't tell me you can't tell me your life number. So is there like a favourite experience that you've had when you're out? I'm thinking of the Channel Country. I'm guessing you've been there in flood.
Yep.
Yeah.
Whether I liked it or not. Yep.
Have you got like a moment in your natural history experiences that stands out above all others?
Yeah, I do. It involves night parrots. So, and it's not a single experience. It's one that I've done a few times, and it's standing in night parrot habitat just, in winter preferably. So there's no flies around, so you can actually hear what's going on. And it's just starting to get dark, and you're looking westwards, so you're seeing the kind of, the deep blues and oranges sort of disappear, and then you hear that sound, the night parrot call, and that's as close to a religious experience that I think you can get. It's absolutely spine tingling. It's unbelievable.
I don't think you're on your own with that, Steve.
Yeah.
Certainly, it's one of the bucket list birds for many Australians, I think, who were, like me, overjoyed to find out that it isn't gone and that it's a little bit more prolific than we would have thought. So hopefully I can stand there, look westward and check out that sky and hear the call. We'll do a ghost bird episode, the night parrot episode, as soon as I can line up the appropriate expert. Steve, I think that's where we get to the end. I can't ask you all the bird nerd questions because you're just not a bird nerd.
That's right.
So it's been great learning about the Artemis Fund. I encourage anybody with an idea to do something, because that's what we're all about with this show, is you can't do everything. Don't do nothing. Do something. Artemis.org.au and become a friend of Artemis and maybe go up there and meet Steve. Who knows? How often do you get up there, Steve?
Yeah, multiple times a year. So this year I'll be up there hopefully, 8 or 10 times, hopefully. Yeah, regularly. Yeah. It's only about 4 hours drive from my home, so it's not too far. Yeah. Mostly sealed. Yeah. So for people who want to come up, it's not as inaccessible as it once was. In fact, I think there's only about 40 kilometres of unsealed road between my door and Artemis now. So, come on up, have a look, camp, have a hot shower, meet Sue, see the parrots.
Terrific. Well, Steve, I'd like you to perhaps have a word with Sue and see if she might like to speak to us when World Parrot Day rolls around. I think she'd be ideal to have on a panel.
Maybe. I'll mention it to her. I know what she'll say. Exactly, something like that.
I haven't got time for that. Okay. Well, Steve, thanks so much. I'm kind of in awe of the planning and the project in general. I think it's going to be a beacon in the future for the way to go about things. Enjoy your fieldwork in the next 2 weeks.
Thanks very much.
I'm Grant Williams. This has been the Bird Emergency. Thanks for listening.